So, hello and most welcome to 1050 or 1050 of the Heidegger series. I will continue with this most interesting text by Ulrich Gumbrecht, and it's a discourse taken from Gespräche über Gespräche, or speaking about language. Oh, sorry. And it's in the conversation, and this is a decisive passage of Gumbrecht, and I mentioned it before. I'm not going to start here again. The decisive passage of the Gumbrecht begins with a reference to the third simultaneity claim we had two previously. Inquirer: that emptiness then is the same as nothingness, that essential being which we attempt to add in our thinking as the other to all that is present and absent. Japanese: surely, to us, emptiness is the loftiest name for what you mean to say with the word being. Inquirer: in a thinking attempt whose first steps are unavoidable even to this day, it did, however, become the occasion for very great confusion, a confusion grounded in the matter itself, and linked with the use of the name being. For this name belongs, after all, to the patrimony of language or metaphysics, while I put that word into title of an essay, which brings out the essence of metaphysics and only thus brings metaphysics back within its own limit. And I quote: it must be emphasized that beyond the conclusion that we drew in our first discussion of nothingness, the full meaning of the concept of nothingness/sein, is not just non-distinctness, non-conceptuality, non-formedness. The concept of sein also contains the non-distinctiveness between presence and absence. Sein is not a pure absence of dividing lines, that is, an absence of forms, and therefore of sense. Sein includes, in addition, the non-distinctness of presence and absence. And because this is the case, the experience of sein, at least in Heidegger's thought, has to be more than just the appearance of the possibility of form emerging out of nothingness. It also needs to be epiphany, which means it needs to be, together with the appearance of possibility of form, the appearance of a possibility of presence, which then of course include the possibility of absence. So this nothingness is the birthplace of both existence and non-existence. And this is why we call it non-distinctive. But it's only non-distinctive from the vantage point of the after the why question, when we have existence and non-existence. But in emptiness or sein, all distinctiveness resides, that we are trying to use secondary in this level, so to speak. So the distinctiveness we have on this level are mere imitations, so to speak. New quote, "What matter then, and still does, is to bring us to the being of beings, though no longer in the manner of metaphysics, but such that being itself, that is to say, the presence of present beings, the twofold of the two in virtue, of the simple oneness. This is what makes it claim on man, calling him to its essential being." End of quote. This is the systematic place where Heidegger's endeavor of overcoming the metaphysical paradigm, he would of course not have simply spoken of overcoming, meets the more existentialist motives of his philosophy, experiencing, keeping, shepherding, according to Peter Sloterdijk's interpretation, the twofold of being, Seiendes, and being, Sein, in its intrinsic complexity, together with the composure of Gelassenheit, which lets this happen, define human existence, Dasein, and are its destiny. Instead of further pursuing this repertoire of existentialist conceptions, however, I will now again focus on the question under which modalities of Sein can be experienced. This question is important for two obvious reasons. Firstly, it will help us to understand why Heidegger was hoping that certain concepts and thoughts traditionally subsumed under aesthetics could become helpful in developing an alternative to the metaphysical paradigm. Secondly, and especially, because pursuing this question will reveal yet a different level among the affinities between Japanese culture and Heidegger thinking. Of course, Count Kuki becomes present again in the dialogue as soon as the inquirer and the Japanese begin to tackle these questions. Japanese. Meanwhile, I find it more and more puzzling how Count Kuki could get the idea that he could expect your path of thinking to be of help to him in his attempt in aesthetics, since your path in leaving behind metaphysics also leaves behind the aesthetics that is grounded in metaphysics. Inquirer, but leaves it behind in such a way that we can only now give thought to the nature of aesthetics and direct it back within its boundaries. Japanese. Perhaps it was this prospect that attracted Kuki, for he was much too sensitive and much too thoughtful to concern himself with the calculus of mere doctrines. He used the European rubric aesthetics, but what he thought and searched for was something else. End of quote. What did Heidegger think Kuki Shuzo was searching for? And what was Kuki really interested in? There is one very factual answer to this question. In the more empirical passages of reflection on Japanese state, quite removed from his ultimately problematic philosophical interpretations, Kuki spends considerable time describing certain gestures that are typical of Japanese geishas and of their grace. This is interesting indeed because Heidegger uses the examples and the concept of gesture, Gebärde, and grace, Anmut, in addition to the concept of the hint, wink or wink, as a part of his ongoing effort to evoke modalities under which we can experience Sein. If Sein, as we have seen, is the site of a simultaneity between the pre-simultaneity moves, of moves that undo distinctions, then the question how we may be able to experience sign brings us back, with increased conceptual complexity and intensity, to the question of how we can experience nothingness. But what do grace, gesture and hints have in common? The answer is again threefold. They all show a form. They all are, in different ways, embodiments of the forms they show. They are all momentous. A way of bringing these three observations together would therefore be to say that grace, gestures, hints and poetic language are all instances of the emergence of embodied forms. Instances in which the emergence of embodied forms goes together with their vanishing. Yet another, even more condensed way of saying the same thing is to call grace, gesture, hints and poetic language instances of epiphany. Now what have such instances of epiphany to do with the possibility of experience nothingness and /or sein? Once we raise this question, it is important to mention that in the dialogue, Heidegger refers to man/human existence as seeking and crossing a border. Quote, Inquirer, then man as the message bearer of the message of the twofold unconcealment would also be he who walks the boundary of the boundless. Japanese, and on this path he seeks the boundary's mystery. End of quote. The border evoked here is the border between, on the one side, nothingness/sein, the realm of multiple non-distinctness, and on the other side, the world as it appears to Dasein, the world as always already structured, interpreted, and meaningful, the world of the beings, der Seienden. If basically the possibility of human experience is limited to structured, interpreted, meaningful worlds, then the only possibility of experience nothingness/sein must indeed be a limited experience. It must be the experience of the moment, of the event in which the non-distinctness of sein almost crosses the border towards the side of form and of the distinction between absence and presence. This would be the moment in which form and embodiment, that is presence as opposed to absence, begin to manifest themselves. But in order to offer the glimpse of an experience of sein/nothingness, this experience needs to be limited to a moment, to an event, a hint, a glimpse. Because as soon as form and presence/absence are there or not there, the impression of non-distinctness has vanished. To see whatever may be regarded as an experience of sein has to be this kind of a limit experience, makes us understand why yet another type of simultaneity, the simultaneity of emergence, coming forth, and withdrawal is such an important motif in Heidegger's thought. We may describe this point in the form of yet another paradox. Whatever we can experience as nothingness/sein, that is multiple non-distinctness, needs to cease being nothingness/sein in order to be experienced. Or, seen from two different but complementary perspectives, in order to experience nothingness/sein, we need a minimum of sense/meaning. But in order to experience nothingness/sein, meaning has to be eliminated. Nothingness with bold ligatures. The phenomena of epiphany, that is gesture, grace, hint, poetic language, are so fascinating to Heidegger because in all of them, the moment of their emergence coincides with the moment of their withdrawal. Finally, this explains how Heidegger could hope that aesthetic experience, and for him aesthetics experience was always epiphanic experience, an experience of sign with specific emphasis on the temporality of this experience, that is, on its specific play of forthcoming and withdrawal, might have particular importance for the epistemological task of overcoming the metaphysical paradigm. Aesthetic experience, this seems to have been Heidegger's decisive intuition, open for us the limit experience of Sein, and it thereby belongs to an epistemology that is based on the contrast between nothingness and Sein, and the world of forms, instead of belonging to the metaphysical distinction between spirituality and materiality. Only Kukishuzo himself could have decided whether Heidegger's speculations about Ikki as a paradigm for the limit experience of nothingness/sign had anything to do with his own observations and reflections. But he was long dead when Heidegger wrote the Gespräch von der Sprache. At least we can now understand how and why Heidegger used in speaking about Ikki two more or less etymological association in order to relate Anmut, grace, with Anwesen, presence, and Einzucken, delight, vid Entziehen, withdrawal. Another quote from Gespräche. Japanese. Ikki is the breath of stillness, of luminous delight, and Entzücken. Inquirer. You understand delight literally, then as what ensnares, carries away into stillness. Japanese. There is in it nothing anywhere of stimulus and impression. Inquirer. The delight is of the same kind as the hint that beckons us, and beckons to and through. Japanese. The hint, however, is the message of the feeling that opens up. Inquirer. Then all presence, Anwesen, would have its source in grace, Anmut, in the sense of the pure delight of the beckoning stillness. End of quote. This definition of Ikki, or rather this way of using some associations around the concept of Ikki in order to explain his own thinking about the possibilities of experience being, may have convinced Heidegger in the process of writing the Gespräch that he had finally found the right access, the opening to Japanese culture. For on the following pages the inquirer asked his Japanese interlocutor to name the most telling concepts for the way in which Japanese culture understands the essence of language. The word the interlocutor dutifully comes up with is koto-ba, which situation the inquirer/Heidegger condescendingly uses in order to explain the Japanese interlocutor his own culture understanding of language. Inquirer. What is the Japanese word for language? Japanese, after hesitation, is kotoba, and inquire, what does that say? Ba means leaves, including and especially the leaves of blossoms, petals. Think of cherry blossoms or plum blossoms. An inquirer, what does Koto say? Japanese, the pure delight, Entzücken, of the beckoning stillness, that which in the event gives delight itself, that which uniquely in each irrepeatable moment, Augenblick, comes to radiance in the fullness of its grace. Inquirer, Koto then would be the appropriate occurrence of a regnis, of the lightening message of grace. Anmut. Japanese, beautifully said. End of quote. Oh, only the most unconditional admirers of Heidegger will not find embarrassing this concluding self-congratulation on his master interpretation of Japanese culture, as only Heidegger addicts will never wish that he had, at least sometimes, dispensed of his etymological speculations. Yet it seems that Heidegger's basic intuition about an infinity between his own philosophy and certain Japanese, or perhaps generally Asian conception of thinking, the relationship between man and the world was not unfounded, or at least much less unfounded than we might imagine in the light of the anecdotal circumstances of Heidegger's relationship with Kuki, end of parenthesis, and that this initial intuition about an affinity pushed him into an intellectually productive direction. For it appears that the metaphysical distinction between matter, that is surface, and spirit, depth, only plays a subordinate, if any, role in traditional Japanese culture. What seems to be as central in Japanese culture as the metaphysical paradigm is in Western culture is a distinction between, on the one hand, nothingness, very much in the sense of Heidegger's concept of Sein, and on the other hand, a sphere of distinctions and forms, of forms that are either absent or present. While it is trivial to insist that the concept of nothingness is more important for any individual Asian culture than for Western culture at large, at least for Western culture in its metaphysical age, the more specific thesis that the concept of nothingness that matters within Japanese culture is nothingness in the sense of Heidegger's Sein. That is, a nothingness that includes the non-distinctness of presence and absence, requires an explanation. In claiming such closeness between some phenomena of Japanese culture and Heidegger's thought, I am relying on the impression that materiality, thingness, and presence and absence occupy a place within Japanese culture that is more unconditional, less relative than the place of materiality, thingness, and presence in Western culture. In modern Western culture, the material, the surface value of signifiers, for example, tends to vanish once we see them in their function as signifiers, thus manage to identify their underlying meaning. Oh, how great! In contrast, the importance of calligraphy is proof that things are different in Japanese culture. and once again, obviously not only in Japanese culture, where the appreciation of writing is largely independent of the meaning that it carries. The same difference becomes manifest in the insight that within Japanese culture, an interpretation, for example, a cosmological interpretation of the arrangement of the rocks in a Buddhist rock garden, will never completely bracket or even eliminate the impression of the thingness, the presence effect of those rocks. Rock gardens seem to function simultaneously in two different ways. First, both as representation of a cosmological meaning to be interpreted and as a material reference for meditation, in which the second function they produce epiphany effects. Undoubtedly, this may also happen under certain circumstances in Western culture, as an ambiguity of reaction or as a structure of oscillation. But instead of being the exception, it seems to be constitutive for Asian culture. Their absence and presence are indeed undivided in this twofold view of the world. Based on the observation that the materiality of things does not seem to vanish in Japanese culture once these things become associated with a meaning, which condition sets them apart, form the metaphysical logic of the signifier and the signified, and a parenthesis. A further-going hypothesis may be ventured, now from a more sociological point of view. This hypothesis says, within Japanese culture, even within modern Japanese culture, the distinction public-private is marginal in comparison to the distinction profane-sacred. The distinction profane-sacred looks like a copy of the distinction between nothingness, or sign, and form, implying a distinction between present and absent. It enables us to think that the dynamics of culture within the Japanese context lie in the never-ending challenge of transforming the profane, the non-distinct, into the sacred, that which has form and is either present or absent. Although this is difficult to accept for Westerners, the non-distinct is always threatening and impure in Japanese culture. For instance, forests are inhabited by demons. This looks like you need to take a dash of water. Sorry about the delay here. Forests are inhabited by demons rather than offering itself as an object of desire, as the pure materiality of nature does under the conception of nature. That is typical for Western romantic and post-romantic cultures. Whatever, in contrast, has been transformed into cultures such as Japanese gardens, which are ostensibly staged as nature formed into culture. Transformed by human effort and design into culture, whatever is identified as culture in Japan. indeed exhibits multiple distinctions and dividing lines. Distinctions and dividing lines that produce forms together with a strong feeling of the contrast between presence and absence. Japanese gardens, for instance, never try to look natural. In this context, it would of course be completely inadequate to think that Japanese culture at large reduces or even avoids the production of sense. If Japanese culture looks like a non-metaphysical culture, it is not because it represses the production of sense. The basic difference rather lies in the different ways of thinking about and of actually staging sense production. For Japanese culture, producing sense is to transform nothingness into forms. For Western culture, producing sense is interpretation. That is either to search for and to identify sense in things and humans, and or to attribute it to them. Nota bene, we've been talking about the voice earlier and how we attribute sense to that voice. The most striking observation of culture otherness, however, lies in the central importance of what I want to call events of epiphany for art and literature in Japan. Japanese art and literature constantly creates scenes where something material comes to the fore and vanishes, gaining or losing form and presence in the process. This is what I mean by events of epiphany. Without a Heidegger interpretation in mind, we can now speculate that as events of epiphany, art and literature in Japan are, to a large extent, engaged in providing the specific experience of nothingness/sein. In the two classical stage tradition of Japanese culture, No and Kabuki, such moments of emergence and withdrawal are decisive and are highly appreciated by the audience. No and Kabuki actors enter and leave the scene by crossing a bridge that leads through the audience to the stage, and the mixed presence-absence situation of their entries and exits, of their emergence and vanishing, often lasts longer than the actual presence on the stage and within the plot. Synchronized in no theater, with therefore Western ears monotonous beat of two types of archaic drums. The actor's body seemed to gain form and presence as they are coming forth from under a curtain and approach the stage. They seem to undo this presence and this form when they slowly withdraw. The demons, who normally take even more time to come to the stage than the human persona, seems to stand between having a form and just being profane non-distinctness. Once they reach the stage, they can become all kinds of human bodies and human roles. But whenever the plots wants them to remain demons, their appearance tend to undo such form. Then their hair looks wild and exuberant, while the rhythm of the tongue sticks up, while the rhythm of their movements is difficult to catch. Their eyes are neither closed nor open, the tongue sticking out. Theirs, we can imagine, is a version of the face of being and nothingness. Kabuki theater, in addition to the coming forth of the persona, produces a specific impression of twofold, of the simultaneity of being and being with a big B, as we can now call it. When male actors of considerable age embody young girls or geishas, Their goal is by no means to produce a perfect, so to speak, seamless illusion. I would say, this is my note, copy or original. On the contrary, and here lies the point of convergence with the self-staging of Japanese gardens. It is very important in kabuki theatre that the spectators are able to perceive and appreciate the simultaneity of, and also the potential tension between, an old man's body and the gestures and high-pitched articulation of a young female body to which the actor's body lends itself as form. This co-presence of inconsumerable elements will evoke a specific sphere of non-distinctnness between male and female, of old and young. A third and final aspect where Japanese literature seems to meet Heidegger's epistemology has to do with what one might refer to as extreme temporality, as the suddenness and shortness of the moment in which sign approaches the threshold that separates it from the world of distinction. It also has to do with suddenness and shortness of signs hints to human existence with a big S. We may read Japanese haikus, those small texts which at first glance look like minimalistic poems on prose, along the lines of Heidegger's observation about the simultaneity of grace and delight. Ein mot en Einzucken, emergence and withdrawal. Almost invariably, the content of haikus invokes the events of an emergence, however, whose material effects are bound to vanish while they appear, like the material effects of a sudden sound or of a lightning. Such scenes of simultaneous emergence and vanishing evoked by the content of the haiku will double the sound impressions which any recitation produced. Some haiku states the suddenness that is strictly object-related. I come by the mountain path. Ah, this is exquisite, a violet. Others gives an explicitly allegorical status to the fact of suddenness. How admirable it is! Who does not think life is ephemeral when he sees a flash of lightning? Now, should the impressions be correct that some of the concepts that Heidegger develops in the dialogue of language are quite adequate for the description of Japanese culture, this would mean that there is something uncanny about the case. In an intellectual climate where, ever since the reception of Edward Said's Orientalism, and for good reasons, we have become skeptical about the possibility of understanding any culture but one's own. How can we possibly accept that somebody as provincial as Heidegger, somebody as culturally blind as Heidegger, to anything outside his self-made Greco-Germanic niche, that this Black Forest tourist got Japanese culture right, although he profoundly misunderstood the one concept, ikki, that he ever really focused on. To attribute this hermeneutic miracle to Heidegger's genius, or to superior intellectual powers of his philosophy, would be noting nothing but intellectual laziness. The case is more interesting than that, and indeed becomes a case in relation to a more general situation, as another eminent Western intellectual, Roland Barthes, who in his book L'Empire des Signes also got Japanese culture right, although, as in Heidegger's case, all the premises with which he approaches it were wrong. When Roland Barthes went on a lecture tour in Japan during the late 1960s, he still considered himself a semiotician. But we know from his subsequent work that Barthes was about to abandon that paradigm. As the title of his book of Japan suggests, he must have traveled to Japan with the idea that this country would be more semiotic, more readable within the binary logic of signified and signified than Western culture. Chapter by chapter, however, Barthes was sincere enough to discuss his reiterated impressions that Japanese culture somehow rejected his logic. He was particularly impressed in this sense by his discovery that Japanese faces did not express states of mind. In this sense, by the discovery that Japanese faces did not express states of the mind, of the psyche, or even of the soul. Commentating on the early 20th century photographs of a Japanese admiral and his wife taken before the day their joint suicide, Barthes writes, "Ils vont mourir, ils le sauront, et cela ne se voit pas." They are going to die, they know it, and this is not seen. Is there a secret condition of success that Barthes and Heidegger approaches to Japanese culture share, beyond the inadequate status of the hermeneutic premises? Less visible than Heidegger's deliberate, almost ideological provincialism and the provincialism of the only apparently cosmopolitan intellectual from Paris is the double biographical and doubly random fact that they were both in the process of taking distance from their own Western dominant culture paradigm in the very situations of their lives during which they approached Japanese culture. To overcome Western metaphysics had definitely become a programmatic goal for Heidegger's philosophizing by the early 1950s. Roland Barthes had begun a self-critical revision of his semiotic theories around 1970s. In both cases, such relative and perhaps only transitory distance toward paradigms that centrally belongs to the Western culture seems to have produced an openness toward the Japanese other. Paradoxically, this openness was not a part of Heidegger's or Barthes's programmatic intentions for this encounter. Rather than a deliberate opening toward the other culture, their attitude was that of an insecurity within their own intellectual paradigms. This half-distance, this lack of security within their own paradigm, seems to have triggered an increased readiness to revise certain premises about the foreign culture, and even to apply such revisions to the relationship that Heidegger and Barth entertained with their own German and French cultures. To use a concept from Claude Lévi-Strauss, who was so immensely popular in the intellectual sphere that Heidegger and Barth inhabited, it was a half distance vis-à-vis their own culture which encouraged Heidegger and Barth to engage in a style of intellectual practice that we call bricolage. Half distance and bricolage may indeed be better premises for understanding of the other than those methods of which we used to dream during the years in which our perennial inferiority complex as humanists had brought us under the spell of social sciences. Well, this is getting more and more interesting. As you know, Roland Barthes has been mentioned many times before, and the Emperor of Science specifically so. It's widely interesting, and it seems that both Heidegger and Roland Barthes have something of a togetherness, and this is shown so clearly by Hans Gumbrecht in this article. One understands what they are pointing to. And also how the distinctions of existence and non-existence are all included in being. So all divisions, all absence and presence, they do reside in being. So everything is there. And it's this distinction, or what could you say, separation, that is being used in the kabuki theater. When people's entrance take much more time than their actual playoff. There are actually lines in the act. So that is widely interesting. It shows that Western culture is trying to solve its own problems by electing the other side. When it's too much ego, they want to elect the other side, the non-ego or something similar. When it's too much existence, they want to choose absence. That, I think this article is pointing to, is not the case in Japan. Neither is to say that existence and non-existence together make up everything, which is nonsensical to a horrid degree. Neither is it to say that one state, the division, the separation, the limit, is excluding the other, or more commonly, that the more unified, non-dualistic is more prominent, more important than the separatedness in distinctions between existence and non-existence, which I think is the most common view and opinion, and I do not agree at all. And there I think the Japanese are in the same line, which Hans here is pointing to. And that is very hard to understand, I think, and could be, as he is indicating, that they did not understand it to the fullest. And then he doesn't continue to speculate what could have helped them, what could have been, so to speak, the thing that really pushed them to the understanding. I don't know, might be that they had to change their modus, the way of being as well. And nothing bar that could have helped. It would have been necessary to a certain point that Heidegger recognized Count Kuki's wife as the prostitute masquerading in the kimono of a Japanese geisha would be. You had to have that discernibility, because to understand all or the nothingness, you need to understand the details. It is a non-excluding. It doesn't say you have to choose between details and non-details. You choose, have both. It's a non-exclusiveness that thereby can exclude, not the opposite around. It's a temporal aspect here. And whereas Heidegger and Barth thinks it's only an existential, spatial, or existence-related problem, I would say it's a temporal too. It's done in the wrong order, and it doesn't cost anything for the understanding in Europe to correct that mistake. What I want to say with that is, once you've corrected it, if you can, it's probably an impossibility, but what would happen with you in European culture, everyone would understand you better within European culture, within the very limits of your Schwarzwälder tourist or Parisian intellectual. I don't seriously think you have to escape that area, but it can still be hard to come to that understanding from those places. But I would say it's still possible, and that's an important point I want to make there, because I think that's a good hint in understanding these things. Sometimes it's necessary to say this is actually possible, even if in actuality it could be that hard, it's never happened, but it would still point to a quality of these things, and therefore it's helpful. Well, very interesting that it got back to Roland Barthes. It was quite unexpectedly on me. I haven't read the 3 last pages before I started with this last part of the article. Well, I say thank you very much, and I wish you a very pleasant afternoon. Bye bye for now.